Today's video is understanding the deadlift, and if that topic doesn't get you excited, I don't know what will if you love the sport of powerlifting. The most famous saying in powerlifting is, the meet doesn't start until the bar hits the floor. This is because the deadlift, for almost everyone, particularly beginners and intermediates, is going to be the single most weight they can lift of any exercise, thus it contributes the most to your total. If you're competing against someone in the same weight class and they outbench you by 40 pounds, you got destroyed. But it's not that uncommon then all of a sudden in a deadlift that you can put 50, 60, 70 pounds on your total compared to someone else if you're a better lifter. I can always tell someone who doesn't really lift that seriously when they're new and I'm like, oh, what do you squat? And they're like, oh, 280. What do you deadlift? 230. No, sorry, you just don't squat low enough. Okay, for almost everybody, especially beginners and intermediates, the deadlift is going to be the most weight they can lift. When you get up to some super heavy weights and advanced people, it can change a little bit, but the deadlift is key. Now, in competition, there's two major kinds of deadlifts that are performed. We have a conventional and a sumo. You are allowed to do stiff-legged and Romanian deadlifts if you want, but there's no advantage to doing that, so I don't know anyone who would intentionally want to do that. So we're going to talk about the differences here, go over the form, the muscles working, and the technique. Okay, and then in our next video, we're going to talk about how to train all of the exercises and highlight some differences. So up here to make life easy for you, conventional is listed in black, and sumo, the differences there are highlighted in blue. Okay, for a clarification, conventional deadlift means your hands are outside your legs. Okay, so that's the biggest definition. Down at the bottom, when you grab the bar, your hands are outside your legs. Sumo means your hands are inside your legs, down at the bottom. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. Conventional is probably the most standard way to deadlift. When most people just say the word deadlift, they're usually talking about this. CrossFit goes so far as to say no sumos. Everybody does things conventional. So when we look at joint movements here, first we got to take a step back and have a little better understanding because sometimes there can be a little bit of confusion. So in our joint movement section, we have our trunk. This is my trunk, right, which encompasses my rib cage and my lower back, and it is able to flex and extend. Okay, probably the most classic example is the exercise hyperextension, which involves trunk extension as you come up. It's worth noting that the trunk refers to this entire area that's relatively locked. We do, of course, have a bunch of individual joints in our spine. Our spine can also flex and extend. Spinal flexion is that rolling down, rounding position. Spinal extension is what you might do like in a cobra stretch. When we're lifting weights, our goal is generally not to do a whole lot at the spine. There's probably going to be a little bit of motion there, but that's going to be more secondary. Generally, we're trying to keep this trunk fixed, and then we're trying to move it forward and backward. So like spinal flexion is a crunch, whereas trunk flexion is more that traditional sit-up where you just come all the way up, but your body's pretty rigid. Okay, spinal extension again is that like cobra, and then trunk extension is rising up. Okay, and then hip, just to be clear, we're not talking about the hip. Hip means the femur is moving. So hip is going to be down here, trunk is here, but the body is a hinge right at this position. So if you fix things on the ground, the same muscles will make your trunk move as would make your hip move. And then if your trunk is free, okay, then that's what's moving there. All right, so we're looking at the conventional deadlift. Conventional deadlift, bar is on the ground, you got to pick it up. It doesn't get much more simple than that. So our number one action here is that trunk. We flex on the way down, but we care about the concentric part, the lifting weights part, so trunk extension. So that's what's happening, and we've got a star there because that's the most important movement, the biggest range of motion in a conventional deadlift. Depending on how some people are built, they're always going to be bent over 45 degrees, and some people are going to be pretty close to 90 degrees as they come all the way up. Okay? There is going to be hip extension, right? Your knees are going to be bent, your hip is going to be forward, and then at the top you're going to lock out. The hip extension part is way less than a squat. So the number one key for people learning how to deadlift is the deadlift is not a squat, especially a conventional deadlift. Many people try to get their butt super low and squat it. That forces the bar out, screws up your mechanics. Really, the deadlift is a jump, is a better way to think about it. So hip extension still takes place, but it's going to be more minor. And then knee extension also takes place, but it's also more minor, and it's more that end range of motion. But my knees for sure will be bent, and then I'll be straightening out those legs. So those are your big 3 actions in conventional. Now let's contrast that with sumo. So sumo is where I spread my legs wide, and then I drop down low and grab the bar. Really, the big goal behind sumo is if you're reasonably flexible and you do this, you can noticeably reduce your range of motion. You can reduce the bar stroke or the bar path, so it's shorter. And shorter means less work and may put you in a good, advantageous position to lift. Sumo still involves trunk extension, okay? But it's going to be a lot less. A perfect sumo for most lifters is actually you get your trunk in the finish position and then you do squat to the bar, okay? And then I just come up from there, right? And I don't have a lot of trunk, but no matter what, you're going to have a little bit of trunk extension. There's certainly going to be a lot of forces attempting to make your trunk flex. So we have trunk extension, but it's not the key. In sumo, we have a key and then kind of an added. So because we are squatting much lower, right? A little gym slang is get your balls to the bar or get your crotch to the bar. Literally, you're squatting down like you're trying to get that. And I do like that cue, not just because it's crude, but because that does teach one to stay upright, right? With other, if you're thinking about just lowering yourself to the bar, you're more likely just to kind of bend over. But you want to literally keep your trunk upright, drop your pelvis, get taint, get that down there close to the bar. So because we bend more, now we have a lot more hip extension, right? So our angle is much greater and we're driving up. It won't be as low as a squat, so your hips aren't going to be below the knee joint, but it could be closer, especially depending on how you're built. But the sumo deadlift's a little interesting. True hip extension takes place in that sagittal plane, and obviously we don't sumo deadlift with our feet really close. Because we go really wide, it's like the bench press, where this was horizontal adduction, and then this is flexion, and the bench is kind of an in-betweener. Well, hip adduction, right, is when my leg's out here and I bring it in together. So hip adduction is also going to be taking place because my knees are going to be very wide, and as I drive up, my thighs are going to move closer together. And that hip extension now, that's your primary driver for the sumo deadlift. Hip adduction takes place where very little adduction, takes place in the conventional. And then we still have knee extension. We have more knee extension because our knees are more bent as well. So the muscles that involve that are going to be more key. Let's go over the muscles, right? So we just want to go through each one of these things and think about what does what. Okay, so first, trunk extension, the number one muscle doing that is your erectors. Okay, erectors are big, thick, strong. Have you ever seen a cross-sectional area of the body? You'll see your abs, which people think is reasonably strong, has these little tiny muscles up here, and then you go to the cross-section of the erectors, and it's like 5 times as thick as the abs. Okay, so the erectors have the potential to be very strong and powerful. They're mainly trying to function in an isometric fashion, but there's definitely going to be shortening there. Your glutes are very important. Some people like to argue which one is the agonist. My personal opinion is erectors are the agonist with glutes as a very secondary, super strong synergist. But if someone wants to argue they're an agonist too, I'm not going to take issue with that. Point is, both are very heavily involved. And then your hamstrings, okay, are also involved because remember they're going to be able to do, okay, by pulling that pelvis down, they're going to be able to do trunk extension. These 3 muscles here, this is PC, posterior chain. So those muscles from the back of your knee all the way up to up here, because remember your erectors run the entire length of your spine, that's considered your posterior chain. So when you sit back, that's like a spring to get you to drive forward. Super important in running and jumping. Okay, that's why deads are favored among a lot of athletes. So those are all super important. The straighter you keep the legs, the more, of course, the hamstrings get involved. But compared to strength-wise, erectors and glutes are way stronger and in a much better leverage position. Right? Just think about it from, some people argue about the erectors. Well, let's say you were going to spot someone on a deadlift, right? Obviously, we don't actually spot someone, but if you were and you were going to spot them from behind, would you grab their pants or their belt and attempt to pull down like this to help them to stand up? Okay, that's going to exercise very little force. Right? What you would do is you would come around and either grab their shoulders or support their chest. That's where the erectors go, right? The erectors start here and run all the way up. So this is the leverage position to lift yourself up. If you try to make yourself stand up, the highest the glutes goes here, the highest the hamstrings goes here. So by pulling this to make your entire body stand up with 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 800 pounds, okay, it's not going to happen. So we need the erectors to be in that good position. Quads are also important. Okay, it's worth mentioning, though, that yes, the glutes and quads are super important, but they don't get an unbelievable training stimulus from the exercise, particularly quads, because they're in a crazy strong position. Just think about what your deadlift position is. Okay, so you're bent down, something like this. Now imagine that I just put a bar on your back and you just had to squat it. So it's like a quarter squat. Now, if the goal was simply to quarter squat, I talked earlier about how much weight we lift in a deadlift, you could probably quarter squat more than that, right? So all we're doing is this is a crazy strong position for us to be in. So the quads, while they're heavily involved, and you'll feel them the most if you ever hurt your knee and then try to deadlift, because then you're like, oh my God, I don't have my quads helping me out. But they don't get a lot of stimulus because they only go through a small range of motion. They're in a super, super strong position. Glutes are definitely more involved, but you still have that same thing going on. They don't work as much as they do in a squat. Traps are super heavily involved. In my personal opinion, deadlifts and their variants, rack pulls, etc., are the single best exercise one can do for traps, even better than shrugs. And so they're going to lock in isometrically, but they're going to receive a massive training stimulus. And then your forearm flexors. Okay, your forearm flexors are the muscles that control your grip, and of course you've got to have a strong grip to be able to hold on to that deadlift. So they're going to receive a significant training stimulus. So we have, your agonists right here. You have your synergists. Then you have very key stabilizers. But everything on this list, again, will respond to the exercise, will get bigger, and will get stronger based on that exercise. Now, if we compare and contrast that to sumo, it's a pretty similar list, but we have a different emphasis. And I try to probably list these essentially in order of importance. So here we have, and really traps, and then might even scooch up. Glutes now become more important because our hips are dropped very low. So the glutes become super important. Your adductors, right? Almost all good sumo deadlifters have big, strong adductors. And honestly, for Gen Pop, right, for you trainers out there, I like sumo deadlifts either with lightweight, you can even use a kettlebell, you can use a vertical dumbbell, something like that, just to train a regular person's adductors. I think they're more effective than just closing your knee or an adductor machine or something like that. So adductors are huge. Remember, 5 muscles in that group. So you got a lot of things that can contribute, Magnus being the most important. Erectors are still for sure involved, right? Hurt your back and go sumo deadlift and see if it's not working. So the erectors are key in there. Quads become more important. There's some debate about how much emphasis you can shift on the different heads of the quads, but medialis is more focused on the lockout primarily, whereas lateralis is more in that bottom portion. Plus, I do believe a wide stance shifts a little more emphasis to that. I know the research is mixed there. But your quads in general, and then personally I think vastus medialis in particular, it gets a good work from sumos. And there's some research that shows that that's kind of weak and sometimes contributes to knee injuries. So for ladies out there, I think that's a great exercise to incorporate. So those 4 are kicking, but now the glutes are going to be more clearly the agonists there. But you can't ignore your erectors. Adductors key. Your traps, once again, have got to be locked in, and the forearm flexors, once again, are super important. Let's take a minute just to talk a little bit about the differences between conventional and sumo other than just general position. So conventional is kind of the traditional way to pick something up. And the reason we love deadlifts in general is because they teach clients how to pick something up. I would also argue that they're by far the most functional exercise one can do if you interpret the word as functional to mean mimicking real life. I mentioned, I think, before in a squat, no one ever really squats. No one puts something on their back, squats down, comes right back up with no change in load, no change in position. When would you do that in real life? You might do a bodyweight squat, but you almost never do it with added load. Bench, it's pretty rare to lay down. Although I remember once I was working on a desk and I had to move it, and I discovered if I laid down and just benched the desk and moved it around, it was the easiest way to do it. But that's neither here nor there. But deads, we do deads all the time. We bend down unloaded, we grab something that has a load and we stand up with it. And then we walk or we move or we do whatever we need to do. Okay, if you were going to pick up a couch, most likely this is how you're going to do it. Now, sumo deads, right, involve that very wide stance. So let's understand a key concept here. When you're doing conventional deadlifts, the goal is you want your feet relatively close together for 2 reasons, at least for the vast majority of lifters. First, we want to be in our power position, which is your jumping position. So I like to tell people, hey, approach the bar, right? Jump and or land. That's a great way to start off with your feet. So wherever they are, when you jump or land, that's your personal power position. Okay, so we want to start with that. More narrow is more ideal, because then with my hands, I can keep my hands more narrow. The wider I have to put my hands, and the wider my feet, the farther I have to bring the bar up, which means I'm increasing the range of motion. So on conventional, a wider stance and a wider grip increases your range of motion and generally makes it harder. You've probably heard of a snatch grip deadlift, which is way out here, and that's extra brutal. Okay? Sumo, then, is the opposite. With sumo, a wider stance and your arms hanging in a plumb line down straight is the way to reduce the range of motion the most. Okay? So it's a different. With conventional, the closer your feet are, the shorter your range of motion. So in terms of just pure range of motion, shortest range of motion would be your feet jammed together. But obviously that's a weak position, so we don't typically do that. But you will see some lifters where literally their heels might be 4 or 6 inches apart. Okay? Then with the sumo, we want to go as wide as we can. Obviously we're limited where the plates are by as wide as we can go. In general, in terms of who should do what, first, they make great assistance exercises for each other. And you don't have to train them super heavy. Even if you're a good deadlifter, let's say for ladies, anything over three plates is a pretty damn nice deadlift. You could practice with, let's say you're doing conventional, you could practice with sumos, do 135, 185. That's still, compared for an assistance exercise, it's still a lot of load. Or vice versa. If you're a good sumo deadlifter, let's say you're a guy who's sumo deadlifting 500 pounds. Okay? Well, you could do conventionals with 2 plates, 275, 315. Compared to another assistance exercise, that's great. Now, you got to watch that lower back, and we'll talk about training there. But they make great assistance exercises. But in terms of who does what, well, let's think about it. Generally, those with long arms and strong backs, okay, and those people who are not as flexible tend to do better on conventional. I personally, when I was lifting, conventional was the best lift for me. It wasn't that far off from sumo, but conventional was definitely better. Okay? Sumo typically requires much greater mobility, right? So you need much better flexibility and mobility to do a sumo deadlift than you do to do a conventional deadlift. You'll see old banged up people, and they'll usually do conventional. Okay? But sumo requires greater mobility and flexibility. Generally, it's stronger legs. So people that have stronger legs tend to do it. In my experience, a little more common with women to do sumo because they tend to be more flexible, but that's, it certainly can balance. And then lighter weights tend to do a little bit better on sumo. But try out both and see where you're at. All right, let's go through a couple of joints and see which one we want to, what are some key points about different joint positions for each one of the lifts. Head. You're going to probably get the most debate about your head position. I'm more passionate about head position in a deadlift than I am in a squat. I wrote a T-Nation article about head position in the deadlift. And so, again, we do have the same general parameters of almost no one's going to recommend that you look at your feet while you're doing a deadlift. Almost no one's going to recommend that you look up at the ceiling. So we're looking at that 45-degree looking down, which is more of that packed neck position, and then that 45-degree looking up. Generally, the argument for the look down is, it keeps the head in line with the spine, it does enable you to pack, and it's probably a little bit safer. We don't love cervical extension, excessively. My kickback to that is there's no load on your neck per se, so it's not like we have a load up here in my head and I'm trying to do a lot of that cervical extension. I've never seen anyone injure their neck, either short-term or long-term, from doing deads. That didn't, so 1 or 2 people moved to the side, but I'm talking about extending. And if you look at our brother, right, or sister in terms of weightlifting, which literally weightlifting, the Olympic lifts, they are cued for sure to look up. Okay, I mean, that's guaranteed right in the beginning. You're going to have that chin high. I personally believe the majority of lifters, one, if you actually watch them lift, they do this, the good lifters, and then the vast majority of people that are out there should have what I call as a chin-high position as the bar approaches your knees. So when you get down, you start to lift, especially if you hit a wall, right? Think about it, you're in the middle of a powerlifting competition. Someone's in a super struggled deadlift, they're at their knees. Are you going to yell out, look up or look down? Okay, if you look down, your upper back tends to kind of round, right? You tend to lose a lot of positions. This is, oh, okay, this guy's not in a strong position. You come in here, you're going to finish, right? Chin, 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 and a lot of good deadlifters have that chin high right until lockout, and then you can kind of see them like set it in, like, okay, now I got it. Give me those white lights, all right? So I believe the majority of lifters should go chin high, either intentionally or allow that to happen as you're pulling up. Okay, if someone just loved having their head packed, I wouldn't cue them out of that. But if I saw them hit a wall and I thought they would do better, then I would say chin, head up. And there's also a lot of research that when your head goes up, your erectors automatically fire harder and are in a stronger position. That's the main reason why they do it in weightlifting, and I think that's going to apply over here. So you can experiment, again, within this range, but certainly my starting point is as you're coming up, don't be afraid to certainly, you're going to be bent forward. If you truly had your head in neutral position, you're basically looking just 6-8 feet in front of you. I wouldn't recommend that. Unless you already had like a back issue or something like that, you might find that you can just kind of pack things a little bit better. So there's some individual variation, but I would definitely cue more chin high on the way up. Okay, our trunk position here is don't be afraid to bend forward. So many people get in this like, oh, okay, I'm deadlifting, and then they try to like squat to the bar. You've got to stick your butt out. It's a hip hinge. A hip hinge is taking your butt and pushing back. If you ever played the sport of basketball, it's boxing someone out. Okay, if you've ever done a kettlebell swing, it's on the way down. Okay, you're going down like this. So we still keep the trunk fixed, right? So it's not a big rounding. So we just bend forward, but on a lot of people, depending on how you're built, that trunk is really going to have to be pretty far down. Okay, if you don't have super long arms or if your legs are a different proportion, you're going to have to, you might even be close to parallel. And certainly you're not going to be able to get those hips any lower than, 45 degrees max. Your pelvis is really important. This goes with the trunk because obviously they're connected. But with the pelvis, you have to learn how to lock, which is drive your pelvis forward, and unlock, which is push your hips back. Okay? You lock your pelvis, meaning you get more neutral position by squeezing your butt and letting, if you think of that pelvis as a bucket of water, now you push it forward and it's straight, it's almost tilted just the hairs bit back. Okay? And then to unlock is like you're going to dump that bucket of water forward where the water falls out like this. So you're going to tilt that bucket, you're going to take that back, right? You're going to unlock, push your butt back, and go down. Not to be lewd, but if you've ever had sex, right, this is the motion of drive in and then pull out. Okay, guys usually get that cue if someone is stuck on this motion. Cat-cow in yoga teaches this, so this keeps that spine healthy. So we've got to unlock, because if you keep the bucket of water, if you try to set the bucket of water down, like try to lower it while it stays flat, that keeps you underneath and that forces your lower back to round as you go down. So many people are afraid to undo that. It's a very powerful, strong motion. So unlock your pelvis, hinge down, grab the bar, just squat just a little bit. Okay, now you're ready to power up. The stance, we were just talking about that. So with conventional deadlift, you want jumping position. And in my experience, as you get more experience, generally try to move your stance in, right? I look back to videos of myself when I was 19 or whatever. I was pretty wide doing that. Still decent at deads, but as I got stronger and stronger, I was able to move my stance in. The exception to that is if someone has a big belly, then sometimes their belly just gets in the way, and so a big dude or a woman will kind of need to have a wider stance just so they can kind of sit down and have that belly in the way. Of course, if someone's pregnant and was doing it, same thing, they may have to widen their stance. But remember, wider stance forces you to move your arms out. Arms wider forces you to bring the bar up another inch. When you're lifting max weight, another inch makes a difference. Okay? Now with sumos, everybody knows you're supposed to go pretty wide on sumos. Okay? With regular deadlifts, your toes will either be straight or out 10 to 15 degrees, probably less than a squat. Although Vincenello, he's in my powerlifting book, he did that kind of duck-footed super wide to get those adductors involved there. So you can play around with that, but most people are out just a little bit. With sumo, you're going to have your toes out probably 45 degrees, so it's pretty significant. So we turn those toes out 45 degrees, and we do try to go wide. Having said that, if you can't budge the weight off the floor, right, there is such a thing as too wide, just like there's such a thing as too wide in bench, so even if it's legally okay, if you just have no power, right, it's great that you reduce the range of motion, but if you got no power, that doesn't help you. So in that instance on the bench, you move your grip in. Well, same thing on sumo. I just saw a good lifter at my gym yesterday doing, she was trying like 310, but her feet were just too wide, and she was not getting the bar up off the ground. Okay, so in that instance, obviously it could just be too heavy, but the first thing you try is, well, come in an inch or two, because that gives you so much more power off the ground when you're in there. And then obviously if you know who Ed Cohen is, and there's some, kind of like a modified sumo stance with sumo, you can bring your feet in even closer, so it's really not that wide. It's almost like a squat stance. The benefit of this is this can be a very strong position for lifters, but on the flip side, it does increase the range of motion. So it's always that balance. We are trying to decrease the range of motion, but we have to do that in a strong position. That's the key. Okay, let me go back 1 second to the trunk for sumos, because I didn't get a chance to talk about that as much. So I mentioned at the very beginning of the video, kind of what I consider to be perfect textbook sumo form. You lock yourself in position. You literally just squat to the bar. I like to think when I grab the bar, my trunk is already locked out. So all I have to do is then just drive up, extend my hip and knees, and now I'm good to go. Almost for sure you're going to have a little bit of an incline forward, okay? And so hopefully you only have to move your trunk 10, 20 degrees. There are some lifters that seem to do basically kind of like a wide stance conventional, where they have that wide stance, so we're still going to call it sumo, but really then they do get a lot of trunk forward lean, and they're still able to lift. Like Jennifer Thompson comes to mind as a good example of someone who lifts that style. If that can work for you, great. I wouldn't call that kind of like the textbook classic sumo, but the bottom line is we're trying to lift some freaking weight. So if that's what works for her and it's safe, that's what we want, right? Perfectly safe, not necessarily perfect form. So perfectly safe, or as safe as it can be when we're throwing around massive weight, that's what we're looking for. But that trunk will vary a little bit more. But if you are super lean forward, then you might just want to think about, well, maybe that means your body's trying to tell you should just do conventional in the first place. All right, when it comes to grip and grip width, so with conventional, you want your hands as close as you can get them, but not so close that they're obviously on your legs, or that they rub super uncomfortably your inside of your forearms next to your legs. But the wider you have your grip, okay, and this can be a 30, 40-pound change. I once had a guy on my team came in, man, I can't seem to deadlift past 4 plates. I'm stuck at like 375. He was grabbing like 5 inches wider than he needed to on each hand. So it was literally like, okay, why don't you move your grip in, and suddenly your max just went up 30 or 40 pounds. Okay, your arms should be relatively straight, just on the outside of your legs. The wider you go, the farther you got to bring that bar up. So here's kind of an example, right? So if I'm standing like this, okay, so it may look like things will move, but if I'm here, when I go wider, right, you see how this comes up? And remember, a good deadlifter, almost for sure the bar is going to be below their crotch. So that's an easy way to tell. You got someone with T-Rex arms who has to bring the bar up here, that's going to be hard for them to lift a lot of weight. So the bar is going to be down low. And then when it comes to grip, you got a couple of choices on that. You can go, the most classic powerlifting is what we call a mixed grip. So if you just do a classic double over, that's how I like to warm up. That's how I like to do some basic sets. It's probably the best for the body because everything is symmetrical. You're getting an even load. But what happens is the bar has a tendency to roll in one direction or another. And when you just hold your hands in the same position, it then is more likely to roll out. And most people can out deadlift their grip if they just do a regular classic pronated grip. So then you have two choices to try to fix this. The simplest, easy fix is to do an alternate grip. That means one hand pronated, one hand supinated. In my experience, most people will go non-dominant hand. So I'm a righty, so my right hand down, non-dominant hand supinated. But that's totally up to you. If possible, it's a good idea to flip so you get a little more even muscular development. But you're almost for sure going to have one that's most comfortable, and when it comes to really heavy weight, you're going to have one that you want to stick with. So for me, it was right hand down, left hand up like this. It does slightly increase the chance of a bicep tear. Having said that, that's really more your form if you are bending your elbows. The elbows have got to stay straight and locked and loose. They're just hooks holding onto the bar. You're not trying to lift up the weight like this. So we want, most likely, an alternate grip. This is the strongest, and it can be dramatic. I mean, for me, there was like a 150-pound difference between what I could grip like this and what I could grip like this. Because now when you do this, this makes the bar roll one way, this makes the bar roll another way, and so the bar stays super locked into your hands and is ready to go. The alternative to that is to do what they have to do in Olympic lifting, because you can't clean or jerk with that alternate grip. So they will do the hook grip, where you take your thumb and wrap it under your fingers, versus a standard grip, which is when your thumb is wrapped around. Okay, so that's a closed grip, normal. A hook grip comes down like this. This is relatively painful, takes a while to get used to. A lot of people put some sports tape on there to try to help. It's particularly hard if you're doing a bunch of reps. So you have to decide. The big negative of the alternate grip, other than that slight bicep thing, is if you look at someone when they do this, little differences happen. Mainly my traps aren't getting the exact same load. I can have a slight shift in my spine. My erectors aren't getting the exact same load. So when we lift, we want to be symmetrical. If you constantly do something asymmetrically, you can develop imbalances. Golf is probably the easiest example of this. You're always going on one side. But if you always do this, so this happened to me a little bit, right? I tried to work on it, but, you know, I liked doing deadlifts, was pretty good at them. So when I'm here, when I'm doing this back and forth, so one trap gets a little bit bigger than the other. That's why you should never shrug with an alternate grip, even though it's easier to hold on to the bar. And then one erector can develop just a little bit better than the other. So my suggestion is if you like the alternate grip, do all your warm-ups double over, do your easy working sets double over, and then switch when necessary. And if you can start out doing a couple of light work sets with the other way, that's fine. If you wait too long, that may feel kind of weird to make that switch. You can use straps, right? If you just want to see if your grip is holding you back, because it may well be. Remember, it's forearm flexor is pretty crucial. Just do a max deadlift in straps. Do it without. If there's a big difference, you got a weak grip. If there's no difference, then grip is not a limiting factor for you. If you're going to do a high rep set and you want to go like double over, you can use straps. But remember, in my opinion, continued reliance on straps for regular deadlifts may screw up your grip. So I would save straps for assistance exercises like some bent over rows or some shrugs, where we want to keep that grip the same, but we can go a little bit heavier. And with sumo, you don't want your grip so close. You want your grip close, but if you're on the smooth of the bar, it's going to be really difficult to hold on to. So for most people, it seems like grabbing like 2 fingers on the smooth, 2 fingers on the grip is ideal. Okay, that way we're in that good position. You can go, out a finger, in a finger, but you want to have your grip on some part of the knurling, right, and not just on the smooth part of the bar. It's going to be too heavy to hold on to. So we've got both kinds of deadlifts. Both are pretty awesome. Personally, I think for regular athletes, the conventional is the main way to go. So if I had a football player and stuff like this, even if they could lift a little more sumo, I would mainly focus on conventional with sumo as an assistance exercise. So I'd kind of concur with CrossFit, say, on that. But if you're a powerlifter, right, we're just trying to lift weight, both can be great. You may find in my career, I started off conventional, got till about, just under 6 on that, switched over to sumo, got it up till about the same. Personally, for me, sumo was more hit or miss, which was a little annoying. And then I switched back to conventional, and then kept bumping it up. Also, it's worth noting that if it comes to reps, most people find that their conversion chart on these two lifts is not the same. So in other words, let's say you rep out 400 pounds, and you can do 400 for 10 on sumo and 400 for 8 on conventional. You might think, oh, well, I can do more, right? I got 2 more reps, so I'll be able to have a better max on conventional. In my experience, that doesn't always equate. So even though you got 400 for 10, maybe you're going to get 490 over here on sumo, and even though you only got 400 for 8 on this, maybe you're going to get 515 on that one. So the point is, you have to use really heavyweight sets of 3, obviously singles, to really judge and see where you're at. But both are awesome. Deadlifts are awesome. That wraps up the big 3. So we've understood the squat, we understand the bench, we understand the deadlift. If you look at all the muscles put together in all 3, remember that covers almost everything in the whole body, except for maybe biceps, and that's why a lot of competitions do a strict curl. But we've now are testing total body strength. Of course, then the follow-up question is, how do we train for these things? And that is next week.